I woke up on October 15th to the sound of the heater turning on and that familiar silence. I checked my phone before breakfast, as I always do, and there was no message. I opened the window of my Cleveland apartment and felt the cold air rush in, remembering Harold for a second. I washed my favorite mug, made a simple coffee, and waited, as if I didn't want to admit I was waiting. I wiped the counter, folded a dish towel, and bided my time. At 10, I started telling myself that people work, that life is fast, that memories come later. At 11, I made scrambled eggs and ate slowly to see if my phone would vibrate. By noon, the silence had already settled like a stone in my chest. I tried to turn on the TV but turned it off because the noise wasn't filling. It was my 61st birthday and no one seemed to remember. Early in the afternoon, Addison texted, "Can you come by at 5?" as if it were a condominium message. I replied, "Yes," and went to fold some blouses that didn't need folding. Michael hadn't called yet, and I found myself defending him in my head. "He's probably at work, in a meeting, in traffic, okay?" I repeated, like someone bandaging a bandage. At 4, I put on some light lipstick, slipped on my clean sneakers, and left with a bag of gifts for Tyler. When I got there, Addison opened the door with a brief smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach your eyes. Tyler hugged me and asked if I could stay with him on Saturday because they had an appointment. I said I needed to see it, and she replied, "Oh, you know how much the family needs you." I glanced at the living room table. There was a store-bought cake with no candles. No one said congratulations when I set my bag on the couch. Michael didn't call until 7:30 when I was already home again. I answered in a hurry, and he said, "Mom, can you come over on Saturday? We really need it." I said, "Today's my birthday, son," and there was a painful 2-second silence. He said, "Gee, sorry. Happy birthday then, we'll celebrate later, okay?" I hung up politely, as I've done since I became a widow so as not to cause trouble. I opened the refrigerator, saw a piece of chicken and a bottle of water, and closed it, not hungry. I stood in the kitchen, staring into space as if someone could give me some guidance. I sat at the table and cut a slice of the cake I'd bought on the way home. I ate in silence, and the sadness gave way to a very clear anger. I understood that if I didn't make my life matter to me, no one would. I grabbed the notebook where I keep bills and receipts and started adding up. Their down payment, $5,000. Health insurance when Tyler was born, $3,200. 2 months' rent during that difficult time, $2,400. Loans never repaid. I lost count, but I wrote down what I remembered. Over the last 5 years, I had withdrawn $47,000 from Harold's and my savings account. I slammed the notebook shut and rested my forehead against the lid. I asked quietly, "And they? What did they invest in me?" The answer didn't come, and I had no more excuses to give. That night, I decided I was going to stop being a resource and go back to being a person. I turned on my old computer and opened a travel website I'd never used. I typed Paris into the search field, and my heart raced as if I were doing something forbidden. Then Rome appeared as a suggestion, and I accepted without much thought. Finally, Barcelona made the cut because I'd always wanted to see those crowded streets. I calculated the dates, 3 weeks, leaving in 10 days. The total came to 15,473, and I took a deep breath. I looked at Harold's photo on the shelf and said, "I'm going." I wrote down the price, confirmed the conditions, and clicked buy. The sound of the confirmation email was like a door slamming shut from inside. I had done something for myself, and no one could undo it. The next day, I got my hair cut at a simple neighborhood salon. I asked them to shave off the excess, leaving the silver strands shining, the way I always hid them. I looked in the mirror and recognized myself in a new way, without trying to look like someone else. I stopped at a thrift store and found a wool coat that fit perfectly. I also bought a pretty scarf, the kind that changes your posture. I returned home light with 2 bags of my own. I printed out the tickets and folded them carefully, the way I used to fold Michael's. Receipts. I made a short list: medications, a power adapter, comfortable sneakers, a notebook. I wrote on the first page, "I, Diane, 61, am traveling alone." I closed the notebook and slept without television for the first time in months. In Paris, the first thing I smelled was the smell of bread on the street in the morning. I bought a croissant, sat on a bench, and no one expected anything from me. I went into a small shop and tried on a cashmere sweater. It wasn't cheap, but I could afford it, and I bought it without asking anyone's opinion. In the afternoon, I tied the scarf around my neck and walked aimlessly, just watching people. I asked a lady to take my picture and I smiled without embarrassment. At the hotel, I wrote, "It's good to be invisible when no one uses you." I video chatted with Tyler and showed him the view from the window. That was all. Addison sent a curt message about an overdue bill that maybe I could help with. I didn't respond. I closed my phone and went to sleep. In Rome, I ate gelato for breakfast because I wanted to. I took a cooking class with a lady named Rosa, who told me to taste the sauce and tell the truth. I said, "It's missing salt and care," and she laughed out loud, patted me on the shoulder, and said, "Start with yourself." I went back to my room and cooked for myself for the first time without thinking about leftovers for anyone. When Addison posted about my vacation, they tagged me as if I were a defendant. Something different happened. Women I didn't even know defended me. One wrote, "Live your life, Diane," and I read it 10 times. I called Michael, and he said my money belonged to the clan. I calmly replied, "I'm not a bank, I'm not a babysitter on call, I'm your mother." I hung up with a firm hand. I had found my voice. In Barcelona, I rented a small apartment through Airbnb, with light walls and a balcony filled with flowers. I made a point of buying fresh bread on the corner every morning and learning how to say gracias correctly. One day, I found a red flamenco dress in a popular store and, without much thought, bought it. That night, I dressed myself, danced alone in the living room to music from my phone, and laughed out loud. For the first time in years, I wasn't seeing myself through anyone else's eyes. I existed because I wanted to exist, not because someone needed me to. Addison's messages continued, increasingly aggressive. One said, "While you spend, we struggle." Another insinuated that disregarding family. But the difference was that now I felt no guilt. I saw her words as stones thrown from afar, powerless to hit me. The unexpected support from strangers online gave me courage. These weren't just my wounds, they were the wounds of many women who had also allowed themselves to be erased. And together, even without knowing each other, we recognized each other. Returning to Cleveland after everything was like walking through a portal. When I opened the door to my apartment, I realized it was no longer the same place. I set my bags on the floor and scattered some souvenirs from the trip around the living room. Photos, magnets, a scarf I hung as a picture. I made dinner just for myself, with cheap wine and cheese I bought at the market. The house seemed to breathe with me differently. I was no longer just a widow, a mother, or a grandmother. I was Diane, and I had new stories to tell. A few days later, I decided to visit Michael and Addison. I arrived, unannounced, with my newfound calm. I sat on the couch in their living room and, before anyone could speak, began listing things. Down payment, $5,000. Health insurance, $3,200. Rent, $2,400. Over 5 years, that's $47,000. They fell silent. Addison fiddled with her phone. Michael stared at the floor. Then I asked, "And you guys, what have you invested in me?" No one answered. That silence was my final straw. I looked my son and said, "From today on, I'm no longer a bank, no longer a babysitter. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be one of respect and genuine affection, not financial convenience." Addison huffed, but I didn't flinch. I stood up and said, "It's up to you whether you want Diane in your lives, but Diane has limits now." I left without looking back, feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time, I had raised my voice above the fear of loss. The next 3 weeks were silent. No calls, no messages, no requests for favors. And you know what I discovered? Peace. I started reorganizing my apartment. I hung paintings, framed photos from my trip, and created a gallery just for myself. I started cooking for my own pleasure, not to please anyone else. One Saturday, I declined a cold invitation from Addison to hang out with Tyler, saying I had plans, and I did. Watch a movie alone at the theater. Going out was already a legitimate plan. Michael finally reached out to me. He came alone. He was haggard, with bags under his eyes, and he confessed that his marriage was in trouble. Addison had exposed our arguments online, and the perfect image she maintained in the suburbs had cracked. He asked to spend time with me, along with Tyler, because he needed space. I took a deep breath before responding. I accepted, but made it clear. This time, there would be rules, and they weren't suggestions. They were conditions he would have to accept if he wanted to share my roof. I drew up a simple but firm agreement. Rent of $800 a month, separate bills, no using me as a free babysitter. Each would take care of their own responsibilities, and respect would be non-negotiable. Michael signed without question, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because he understood. I hugged him, but not as a mother desperate for affection, but as a woman aware of her worth. There in that moment, I realized that the invisible Diane, only the whole Diane remained, capable of loving without sacrificing herself. The first few days with Michael and Tyler at home, I confess, it was strange. I was already accustomed to the silence of my routine, my things in their place, my time all to myself. Suddenly, there was a backpack thrown in the corner, sneakers in the hallway, and the sound of cartoons in the living room. But there was also something good, the presence of a child who reminded me to laugh at the little things, and my son's look that seemed, for the first time in a long time, like a wordless plea for forgiveness. Still, I remained firm. No more returning to the role of invisible maid. I cooked dinner on my first Saturday and made it clear it wouldn't be a habit. "I'll do it today, and you can do it tomorrow, Michael," I said, looking at him. He smiled awkwardly, but he did it. He made simple pasta, got the salt wrong, but Tyler ate it, laughing. Seeing my son struggling to be an adult in my house was a scene that moved me. Not because I wanted to care, but because I finally realized he could care too. It wasn't just about me giving anymore. Now there was an exchange, even if timid. The bills arrived at the end of the month, and I showed him the amount. Michael paid his share without complaint. It was symbolic, but powerful. For the first time, I didn't have to explain, I didn't have to beg, I didn't have to remind anyone of what was fair. I simply set the rules, and they were followed. It gave me a sense of silent victory, as if I had proven to myself that it was possible to live in harmony without sacrificing respect. During this period, I began to occupy my time with new things. I signed up for a ceramics course I'd always wanted to try. The first day, my hands trembled as I molded the clay, but after a few minutes, I loosened up. I didn't need perfection, just the feeling of creating something that was my own. I returned home with a crooked piece, but I placed it on my shelf as a trophy. There was proof that I could build a life beyond being a support for others. On Sundays, I began to reserve mornings just for myself. Tea, a book, and the window open were enough. Tyler would sometimes come sit beside me without asking for anything, just sharing the silence. These moments were special because they showed that affection could exist without demands, without exploitation. I didn't need to sacrifice myself to be loved by my grandson. It was enough to be truly present in my own way. Michael, little by little, began to open up. One night, after Tyler fell asleep, he told me his marriage was truly over. He said he was afraid of repeating his father's mistakes, of losing his family, of becoming a failure. I listened silently and, for the first time, didn't try to solve the problem. I just said, "You need to take charge of your life. I've already done my part." It was hard, but also liberating. I was no longer his emotional shield. I was just his mother, in the most human and simple sense. 3 months later, Michael and Tyler moved into a small apartment. I helped move some boxes, but I didn't give up on my new attitude. I gave them a sincere hug and said, "It's your turn now." I returned home and felt a momentary emptiness, but it soon gave way to a serene relief. It was as if my home was mine again, ready for new stories. That same weekend, I received an unexpected invitation from a neighbor in the building, Frank, a friendly widower I already knew by sight. He invited me for coffee and I accepted. We talked for hours about music, old movies, and travel. I didn't feel the need to impress or please. I was just there, completely, talking as a woman, not as a supporting role. I left that meeting with a different smile, the smile of someone who realizes that life can still bring good surprises. After meeting Frank, I began to indulge in things I'd previously considered nonsense. I accepted lunch invitations, went to a neighborhood craft fair, and even signed up for a book club at the community library. At first, I was shy, thinking I wouldn't have anything to add. But when I shared the story of my journey, I noticed other women approaching me with a sparkle in their eyes. I discovered that sharing my experience wasn't bragging. It was paving the way for others to believe it was possible to put themselves first. Addison, of course, didn't miss the chance to try to get at me. She posted another indirect message on social media talking about certain selfish grandmothers who prefer to spend money on travel rather than on their family. This time, it didn't hurt. I simply showed it to a friend from my book club, and we laughed together. The difference was that now I didn't feel alone in the face of such cruelty. I had a network, I had a voice, and most importantly, I was confident in my worth. Nothing she could write could undo what I had already experienced and achieved. One day, while grocery shopping, I ran into a neighbor who commented, "I saw your photos from Europe, Diane. You looked so happy." I thanked her and told her it had truly been a turning point. That phrase echoed in my head. It was true. That trip wasn't just tourism, it was a kind of belated birth. For the first time, I felt that life hadn't passed me by, that I could still write new chapters. With Frank, things became light and natural. He invited me to a jazz concert, and during the music, I realized I was relaxed, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. There was no obligation, no pressure, just two adults sharing a beautiful moment. I went home that night and thought, this is it. I can love someone without losing myself. I can live without carrying weight that isn't mine. This realization brought me a different kind of peace. Tyler was still present, but now in a healthy way. He'd come over some weekends, play with me in the kitchen, and say, "Grandma, you've started smiling more." Hearing that from him was like receiving an invisible gift. I could tell he was growing up with a different image than I did. Not of the grandmother who lives to serve, but of a woman who also has her own life. This, deep down, was also a lesson for him. I started investing in small things for my home. I changed the living room curtains, painted a wall myself, and bought flowers for the table. I didn't need much, but every detail was like saying, "This space is mine and it deserves care." Before I did this, thinking about guests, thinking about pleasing those who came. Now, it was just for me, and that changed everything. I felt like I owned my space, my story. Michael, in turn, began to appear with a different outlook. He didn't come asking, he came to talk. One time, he brought a prepared dinner and said, "I want to thank you, Mom. You made me realize I needed to stop being dependent." It was hard not to cry at that moment. I knew it wasn't just about money. It was about finally growing up. That too was a result of my change. When I turned 62, I organized a small celebration at my apartment. Nothing grand. A few friends from my book club, Frank, Tyler, and even Michael. It was the first time in years I'd heard a sincere happy birthday with real hugs. I bought a beautiful cake with colorful candles, and when I blew it out, I felt like I wasn't wishing for anything impossible. I'd already achieved the essentials: respect, autonomy, and the joy of truly existing. Simple birthday party. I began to feel part of a new circle. My book club friends would invite me to walk in the park, and I would accept without hesitation. I discovered that I didn't need grand plans to be happy. Presence, conversation, and laughter were enough. One afternoon, sitting on a bench, one of them said, "Diane, you inspire. We see that there's still time to reinvent ourselves." That resonated with me because for so long I believed I was too old to start over. Now, I saw that it was not only possible, but necessary. Frank became a constant presence. He respected me, didn't pressure me, and that made me feel comfortable. I could say no to an invitation, and he understood without drama. One day, we went to a Mexican restaurant, and he held my hand so naturally that I realized I was no longer afraid. It wasn't replacing Harold, it wasn't a comparison. It was simply a new phase with room for lightness. Life was showing me that I could open doors without erasing what I'd already experienced. Over the months, Michael began rebuilding his life. He got a bigger apartment, reorganized his finances, and, for the first time, talked to me about therapy. "I think I need to face my own standards, Mom," he said. I listened, proud. Not because I wanted to control him, but because I saw that, somehow, my decision to set limits had become an example. He was learning that taking care of himself isn't selfish. It was an unexpected but powerful reflection. After the divorce, Addison tried to get closer to Tyler, still using the same victim language. But the difference was that now Michael no longer accepted everything silently. I watched from afar without interfering because it wasn't my place to resolve the situation. Deep down, I felt the cycle was breaking. I had done my part, cutting the bond of dependence and exploitation. The rest was up to them. It was a relief to realize I could love without burdening. I myself began to dream new dreams. In ceramics class, my pieces were already improving. A friend suggested exhibiting at a local fair, and even though I was shy, I accepted. Seeing my creations on a table, with people praising them, was like recovering a piece of myself I hadn't even known existed. I was no longer just Michael's mom or Tyler's grandmother. I was Diane, who had traveled, who had created, who had lived, and who was now showing what she could do. Short weekend trips became a habit. I'd take the car, go to nearby towns, try restaurants, visit small museums. Each trip was a way to remind myself of what I learned in Europe. Life is made of choices. I didn't need to cross the ocean every time to feel alive. I just needed to break out of my routine and allow myself to experience new things. One Sunday afternoon, I sat with Tyler looking at photos from my trip. He pointed to the Eiffel Tower and said he wanted to see it. I smiled and said, "One day you will, but you need to understand that life begins now. Always value yourself, my grandson." He nodded, perhaps not fully understanding, but I knew those seeds would remain. I wanted to be remembered not as someone who sacrificed herself in silence, but as someone who showed that there is life at any age. Over time, I realized that my story was serving as an inspiration to other women of my generation. At book club, some told me they had the courage to say no at home, to save money for themselves, to dream again. I heard these stories and felt it wasn't just my victory. It was a silent but powerful movement of women who decided to see themselves. And this made me even more certain that the invisible Diane was behind me forever. One day, while tidying up my closet, I found a box of old photos of Harold. I sat on the floor and spent a long time looking at each image. I missed him, of course, but I realized it wasn't a feeling of longing that paralyzed me anymore. It was a fondness for what we'd shared and a recognition that life had moved on. I whispered, "You'd be proud of me, Harold. I finally learned to take care of myself." I closed the box calmly, without desperate tears, just with gratitude. Little by little, I began to talk more openly about my journey. A friend invited me to share my journey with my church group. I was nervous at first, but I accepted. When I finished, many women approached me, some with tears in their eyes, saying they saw themselves in my story. It was then that I realized that sharing wasn't exposing, it was empowering. Turning pain into learning made everything make sense. I hadn't lived in vain. Frank also became part of this process. He encouraged me without trying to control me, and that made all the difference. When he saw me wavering, he'd say, "Diane, you faced greater things before. There's no need to be afraid now." And I believed him. I felt he saw me as an equal, not as someone fragile to be rescued. This was new to me and very valuable. Michael and Tyler were still present, but in a different way. Now, the meetings were planned, arranged around my schedule. I wasn't always available, and this taught my son that I had my own life too. One day, he even laughed and said, "Mom, you're busier than me." That was music to my ears. It was proof he understood. At book club, we began discussing not only novels, but also our own lives. One friend said she wanted to learn to drive. Another talked about starting a small business. I realized we were all searching for something similar, to reclaim our right to be protagonists. It wasn't a competition, it was a silent support network, and that gave me even more strength. I received an invitation to participate in a larger craft fair. I displayed my ceramic pieces and, to my surprise, sold 2 of them. It wasn't for the money, but for the validation. Someone found what I'd created with my hands beautiful. I put the money I received in an envelope and wrote, "For my next trip." It didn't matter when, but I would still be new paths. With Frank, things progressed naturally. We didn't talk about a heavy commitment, but about sharing. We went to a park on a sunny Sunday, and he asked me to take a picture of myself. When I saw the image on his phone, I smiled differently. It was a free smile, without weight, without fear. I recognized in myself a woman who had come fully into being. The following birthday, I organized another gathering at home. This time it was bigger. Friends, neighbors, grandson, and Frank. When I looked around and saw everyone laughing and talking, I realized I had rebuilt not only my life, but also my place in the world. I was no longer a backdrop, no longer invisible. I was the woman who had dared to say yes to herself and in doing so had changed everything. One day, walking downtown, I passed a travel agency. I stopped, looked at the window with its colorful posters, and felt my heart pound. I walked in without much thought and picked up some brochures. The attendant asked me if I had any destination in mind. I smiled and said, "Not yet, but I want to plan something just for me." I left with maps, ideas, and the wonderful feeling of having a future ahead of me. I was no longer living in waiting mode. During my ceramics course, I befriended a young woman named Clara in her early 20s. She said she admired my courage to start over after turning 60. I was surprised because I never imagined I'd be a role model for someone so much younger. We talked a lot, and I realized that life doesn't impose an age limit on learning or teaching. The exchange between generations showed me that my value doesn't diminish with time. On the contrary, it can even increase. I also received an unexpected invitation to give a short testimonial at a women's meeting in the community. I accepted. I shared what it had been like to travel alone, to be judged by my own family, and to return stronger. When I finished, a woman hugged me and said, "You gave me the courage to save my money and do something for myself." I left with a full heart. If my story could spark sparks in other lives, then it was worth it. At home, I began writing details of my experiences in a notebook, not with the intention of publishing them, but to record them. I wrote about Paris, Rome, Barcelona, but also about small things: the taste of gelato at breakfast, the comfortable silence of being alone, the feeling of saying no without guilt. Rereading them, vivid memories they were, and that I would never be invisible again. It was as if I had built an archive of my own dignity. Tyler continued to be a constant joy. One day he drew a picture of me in a red dress and wrote underneath, "My happy grandma." I showed it to Michael and he was moved. He said, "He sees you as a role model, Mom." That touched me deeply. I had not only changed my own life, but also the image my grandson would have of what aging means, not as a synonym for erasure, but as the of blossoming again. Frank began inviting me on short trips. We went to a nearby town famous for its wineries. We walked among the grapevines, laughed and toasted. He looked at me and said, "You have a glow, Diane." I believed him. For the first time, I didn't think it was an exaggeration or a lie. I understood that the glow didn't come from outside, but from within, from everything I had chosen to change. One quiet evening, I sat on my apartment balcony with a glass of wine and reflected on my entire journey, from the forgotten birthday to the click of the purchased ticket, from the public humiliation to the strength I gained. Each step had brought me to this point. I no longer felt indebted to anyone. I was at peace, living a life that was finally mine. I then decided to make a new promise to myself. I would never again put aside my desires for fear of displeasing others. I wrote it down in my notebook. To be loyal to myself above all else. It was simple, yet powerful. This phrase guided my choices from then on. I knew the challenges would never end, but now I had the tools to face them without losing my cool. A short time later, I received a message from Addison. It wasn't as aggressive as before, but cold and calculated. She said she hoped I'd learned to value family. I read it slowly, considered replying, but deleted the draft. I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to her. Silence was my answer, and for the first time, I didn't feel burdened by not justifying myself. It was liberating. Michael, on the other hand, was showing increasing signs of maturity. He began taking on responsibilities at work and even mentioned that he was saving money for his own project. I was proud, but I didn't show it like I used to, with exaggeration. I simply said, "Good choice, son." and I realized that this simple adult-to-adult tone was what cemented our new relationship. It was no longer dependence, but mutual respect. My book club friends started calling me the Traveler. I laughed, but deep down, I liked it. It was as if this nickname constantly reminded me that I had crossed an important frontier. Not just the ocean, but the one that had trapped me. Every time someone asked me for travel tips or the courage to take a step, I remembered the old Diane and felt proud of the new one. One day, Frank told me he was thinking about visiting Europe and asked if I'd go with him. My heart raced. The idea of returning, this time with someone excited and frightened me at the same time. I said yes, but with one condition. I want to keep my moments to myself even when traveling with someone. He smiled and said that was exactly what he admired about me. I understood that I didn't have to give up my autonomy to share experiences. In my ceramics course, I produced a piece that was chosen for prominent display at the fair. It was simple, but had a firm form, unlike the first ones I made. When I saw it on the table, I realized it was a reflection of me, shaped by time, marked, but resilient and beautiful in its own way. I didn't tell anyone this, but deep down I understood the symbolism. I was also on display, but now consciously and fully. One Saturday, I took Tyler for a walk in the park. He ran, played, and then sat next to me on the bench. He said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to be happy like you." That touched me more than any gift. It was proof that my transformation had become a positive reference for him, not of sacrifice, but of a full life. On my next birthday, I traveled again, this time to Chicago. It wasn't Europe, but it didn't matter. I walked the streets, visited museums, and took photos without anyone rushing me. It was confirmation that I didn't need grand gestures to feel alive. I just needed to remember myself. This trip was short, but full of meaning. Back home, I decided I wanted to make a painting with photos of my travels and recent moments. I put up a sort of visual timeline on the living room wall. When I finished, I looked at it and realized here was concrete proof that I hadn't just survived. I had lived, and that, for me, was the greatest victory of all. One day at the grocery store, I ran into an old coworker. She looked at me in surprise and said, "Diane, you look different, more enlightened." I smiled and thanked her, without elaborating, but deep down, I felt it was a silent acknowledgement of everything I had changed. Before, I was remembered
Woman
as
who
the
withdrew
discreet.
from herself.
Now, I was seen as someone who had rediscovered her own light. Frank and I were strengthening our relationship. We didn't talk about marriage, but about companionship. He understood my pauses, my moments alone, and this only reinforced my desire to be with him. One Sunday, he brought me flowers for no reason and said, "Only because you deserve them." I arranged the bouquet on the table and thought, it's not about needing someone. It's about being able to share without losing yourself. That was the greatest lesson. Michael told me he was meeting someone new. I listened without judgment, just hoping for a healthy relationship. He himself commented, "I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, Mom." I felt this recognition wasn't just his, but also a reflection of what he'd learned from me. Sometimes, one person's change opens the door for others to transform as well. I continued attending the book club, and at a meeting, one of the women said, "Diane, you should write your memoir." They all agreed. I laughed, changed the subject, but deep down, it stuck with me. Maybe it really was time to write it all down, not for fame, but to leave a testament that it's never too late. Tyler, growing up quickly, began asking me questions about Europe. I showed him photos and told him stories, and he was fascinated. One day he said, "I want to save money like you, Grandma." I laughed and said, "Save it, but not just to spend on others. Save it for yourself, too." I wanted to instill in him from an early age what took me a while to learn. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. At home, I continued investing in small details. I changed the sofa cover, painted a new wall, and hung more pictures. Each change was a reminder that I had control over my life. I didn't need to wait for anyone's approval. I owned my space and my choices. This was reflected in everything: the way I spoke, the way I walked, even the way I looked in the mirror. One night, I sat on the porch with Frank and Tyler. We gazed at the stars and were silent for a few minutes. Afterward, Tyler said, "This is the best moment of my day." I looked at him and realized that simplicity was what truly mattered. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about truly being present. I then decided my next step would be to travel again, but this time taking a friend from my book club with me. I wanted to share what I had discovered, a sense of freedom. When I told her the idea, she cried and said, "I never thought it was possible." I smiled and replied, "Me neither," until the day I decided to buy that ticket. The trip with my book club friend was to California. We rented a car and drove along the coast, stopping in small towns, taking pictures, and laughing like teenagers. She would often say to me, "Diane, you gave me courage." I realized my transformation hadn't been confined to my life. It was spreading, touching others. This was one of the greatest gifts I could receive. When I returned, I found a message from Michael. "Mom, thank you for never giving up on me, even when I couldn't see anything." I read it and cried, but not from pain. I cried from relief, pride, and peace. I knew he had found his own path, and so had I. Now, our relationship was based on choice, not obligation. That changed everything. Tyler came to spend the weekend with me and brought a drawing from school. On it, he wrote, "My hero is my grandma." I put that paper on the fridge, and every time I open it, I still feel a warmth in my chest. Not out of vanity, but because I knew I was able to show him that true love isn't about giving up, but about standing firm. Frank and I went to a local music festival together. We danced, ate local food, and walked home laughing, hand in hand. On the way, I thought about how I never imagined that after 60, I would experience such a lighthearted time. I understood that there's no age limit for feeling alive, for allowing yourself to love, for starting over. This realization gave me a sense of victory that no one could take away. On my 63rd birthday, I gathered friends, family, and neighbors in the building's lobby. I set a beautiful table, bought flowers, and a cake with colorful candles. When everyone sang happy birthday, I closed my eyes and thought, I made it. Not in the sense of arriving somewhere perfect, but of having found dignity, respect, and joy. I opened my eyes and saw my son smiling, my friends celebrating, Frank by my side. It was the picture of a life rebuilt, so I decided to write my memoirs. I don't know if they'll ever become a book, but I know they're already a record of what I experienced. I write without embellishments, just as I'm telling it now, direct, truthful, just as it happened. I want someone in the future to read them and understand that there's no age limit for breaking patterns, for choosing yourself, and for starting over. Today, when I look back, I don't just see the pain of abandonment on that forgotten birthday. I see the turning point that made me buy a ticket and change my destiny. It was the day I realized that if I didn't value myself, no one would. And I chose myself. That choice was the seed of everything that came after. I conclude this story by saying, I am no longer the invisible Diane. I am the Diane who traveled, who said no, who set boundaries, who loved without losing herself. I am the Diane who was reborn at 61 and who with now the certainty that life only makes sense when we learn to be true to ourselves.